in another opportunity in the geriatric care segment. Quickly moving on to the biotech sector, the sector ranks amongst the sunrise sectors in India. It already has a market size in excess of $12 billion, with biopharma being the biggest contributor, followed by bioagri and bioservices. I know there are more than 4,200 startups. I think this number might have increased to 5,000 by now. It is a large number in this space. Majority of these startups are in herbal tissue culture, micropropagation, food nutrition, biofertilizers, and diagnostic verticals. Biopharma has attracted the most number of startups. Devices segment has several startups. Agri and clean tech are also seeing some action. Again, this is a non-exhaustive list. Several of these startups such as MedGenome, Bugworks, GPS String have raised large funding rounds in excess of $20 million. And while we will discuss about fundraising later, just for biotech startups, and the following come to my mind. We'll talk about the capital part in the upcoming panel discussion. There's a clear shortage of talent. We need more bright people to join this sector. Perhaps all these stakeholders present in this webinar can work towards it. It also seems that there's a lack of balance between R&D and monetization in several startups. A lot of biotech startup founders come from research background, PhD masters, and sometimes they fail to prioritize business over research. And I'd like to leave the audience with a thought on this last point. And for this thought, I'll just draw upon the famous BCG metrics from yesteryears. This is a simple framework which works in deep tech and can therefore work in biotech too. This emphasizes essentially the balance required between resources and monetization. The products being developed are classified into 4 quadrants. And the first quadrant, also known as the cash cow, consists of products with the low resource requirement but high monetization potential. Second quadrant, known as the rising stars, consists of products which require high amount of resources but also has a high monetization potential. The third quadrant, symbolized by a question mark, comprises of products with low resource requirements and questionable monetization potential. In other words, the complete potential of such products has not yet been discovered. And the last quadrant, which is often symbolized by dog, consists of products with a high resource requirement but a low monetization potential. In other words, these are often R&D projects done just for the sake of research. My recommendation to biotech startup founders would be to target having at least one cash cow to start with. Once you have a cash cow, spend resources to develop a few rising stars. On the way, if you end up with a few question marks, it's fine. It is possible some products in the third quadrant eventually end up in the first. However, you have to absolutely avoid the dangerous fourth quadrant. So that's it from my side today. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, sir. Moving on, it's the time now for a panel discussion on what investors look for in health tech, biotech, pharma ecosystem startup. It's an absolutely pleasure to welcome our panelist, Dr. Pinak Shikhande, Director Health Cord, Advisor Private Limited, Dr. Mansi Agrawal, Partner Alchemy Ventures Partners, Mr. Arpit Agrawal, Director Bloom Ventures. The session will be moderated by Mr. Arpit Agrawal. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, BIRAC, IVCA, for giving us this opportunity, Startup India for giving us this opportunity to address all the lovely startups here. And, I think there could not be a better and more equipped panel that I have been given to moderate and have a discussion with. So it is totally apt, and thank you for putting this together. I've just given a little quick overview about what we do. Bloom Ventures is an early stage venture capital firm. We are not deep tech, having 10 or more investments in deep tech sector. 2 companies over the history which are
in India. The fund was launched in 2016, and since then we are now investing from our second fund. We investment Series A, Series C companies, which have proved revenue at $1 million, and in checks of a minimum check of 6 million can go all the way up to $20 million. So that's the kind of we look at equity. We generally try and avoid pre-revenue. As a personal background, I come care itself. So the critical care medicine Fortis Group of hospitals for almost 10 years prior to joining health, and prior to that, as
ecosystem has evolved, but what more remains to be done?
Much, Arpit, and thanks Biotech, IVCA, and Startup India for putting this panel together. I wish this panel was available when I was an entrepreneur. So really miss this kind of an ecosystem engagement. But just before I answer your question, Arpit, as a background, I'm a partner at Alchemy Ventures, which is also a healthcare-focused fund like HealthQuad. But we tend to come in at slightly earlier stages with check sizes anywhere between $1 to $5 million. We started in about 2018. And since then, since it's healthcare focused, I've invested in 10 startups across a variety of subsectors within healthcare, from diagnostics to retail pharmacies to, unfortunately, not much in biotech space, but with a new fund launch, hopefully some investments in the biotech industry as well. To answer your question, Arpit, I think Pinak has covered a lot of points that I already had, so I'm just going to add to a few of what he said. I think as an entrepreneur, I have made all the classic mistakes that I think everyone has also made who are listening to this. And as Pinak had also mentioned, I had started a medtech company which was focused on one product in a very niche segment of the market. And I guess this is a very classic entrepreneur mistake. You start with one problem because you just tend to want to solve one thing, and you just want to get success there, and only then build out a portfolio of products. You need to start with one problem, solve it, then move on to the next. Otherwise, there's only so much bandwidth that I think any entrepreneur, and I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs may be nodding their head, with a solid commercial and a business plan. And it also goes back to what Pinak had said. They're not able to fully articulate how distribution of that product will be done if it gets developed in the first place. So I think it just remains an R&D idea, and a lot of companies that we have also evaluated or seen in their early stages, I think the bridge between R&D project versus a viable commercial business, I think that bridge is something that we have not seen many companies be able to articulate. For an early stage founder can be very valuable, even if it may mean your exit opportunities might reduce a little bit. But I think the early support that a startup requires to scale and grow, and for it to become a viable option for a VC funding somewhere down the line, I think that access gets bridged. And I think also VCs tend to get a lot of confidence if a strategic is on board, because it validates the product, it validates the business model sometimes. And I think I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs shy away from that route. So I would really encourage and urge you guys to start looking at some of these partners early on, if they are available to you. Thirdly, I think a lot of healthcare companies or early stage startups, they also are not articulate or communicating their pricing, the distribution, the scale up plans beyond India as well. I think the Indian market is just one of the markets that they can tap into. But unfortunately, a lot of the VCs have not seen a lot of success based in India alone. And I believe that if a problem in biotech is being solved in India, it certainly has some global application to it. Like we've seen in SaaS, and now it's expanding to SaaS across all subsectors. So I think also just thinking about, are there global implications to what you're building? And maybe look at some global capital as well, because I think Indian capital, as much as we collectively try and move the ecosystem forward, it may still be a very small provider of the kind of capital that required for this ecosystem to move forward. So I think
who in also very viable source of capital for early stage companies.
Super. Thank you, Mansi. This is lovely and great perspective. You have had a chance a bunch of anyway. If you want to also give us introduction about Trifecta again.
Yeah, I guess I covered that part. The only part was, I have been an entrepreneur in the healthcare space.
Yeah.
So, early on, almost 11 years ago, I was involved with the question you asked, Arpit. I think at least till now, the case has been that the mainstream sectors have always been favored. Over the relatively niche deep tech and biotech sort of is a subset of deep tech space. It feels like with so much money coming into play, maybe these startups will start getting some more love from the investor community. One point which I think biotech entrepreneurs often tell me is that there's also expertise when it comes to life sciences knowledge. And being a community, I don't blame them. We have our own priorities. But that is one thing which the VC community, work on. Because sometimes, maybe get, some life sciences expert on board who can sort of talk in their language. And again, discussion. So perhaps this might help. Second point I would like to highlight is, Pinak did refer that there are some regulatory constraints. So my suggestion to the startups is that look at spaces which are not that closely regulated. Perhaps, if you compare to pharma, for example, sectors such as animal nutrition or plant nutrition are not that closely regulated. And hence it might be, the red tape involved might be much lesser. So, the startup community can look at these spaces where they are likely to hit the hurdles less and where they can kind of focus on the product and the development more.
Super. Thank you. This is lovely. Now changing gears and now putting all of you back in the spot and saying, okay, what would you like to see companies do better? Is it only about the pitching? Is it about what are the early signs? I know that pitching is an art. A lot of it depends on the subjectivity of the person on the other side. However, there are a few things that you have seen companies do which allow them to be a lot more successful. Put biotech hat on, but also talk about broadly healthcare. Mansi, you want to start this?
Sure. I think I did touch upon, the pitch part and what needs to be articulated. What I'm going to add is that, and again, I don't know if it's relevant to all startups or not, but I think, either as a team to have a balance of a technical person and a business person, I think is quite relevant. So what I'd love to see more is a complementary team that comes together, wherein one person could be focused on the R&D, on the science part of the business, and the other person's more focused on how do we scale this up, how do we take this to market, because go to market itself is something that needs to be bridged over a long period of time. Product market fit is something that needs to be established, and I think that's where most companies fail. So I think that has honestly been one of the biggest challenges. Sometimes we found a great technology but have not had enough confidence on the founder being able to commercialize the technology that they've built out. So I think that's something I would actively work towards as the companies are maturing enough to come to a VC for funding.
Okay. And what about pitches?
I think in pitches, again, so I think one of the challenges I've always had is either the market size has been overestimated or underestimated. I've never found a balance of a reasonable market size that is that seems truly addressable. Sometimes the numbers are upwards of 100 billion as a addressable market size, and that's too off. And I think all of us at the panel know that. So I think just doing some more work on what a true market for their own product looks like, and by true market, it could mean market based on geography, market based on product segment, by user segment, and by by the distribution segment. And there are multiple other ways. I'm just taking the highest priority items. So I think that's something, if they can communicate, articulate, and why they are better positioned in solving that problem. Because as we all know, biotech problems or the life science issues that they are solving may not be local in nature. These are products that have global implications. So what makes them unique? What makes them the right candidate for funding in a market that eventually will have global acquirers, global deals, and probably have seen or are seeing similar companies from across the world.
Okay, great. Thank you. Saurabh, would you want to touch upon what makes a startup more fundable, which is
I'll actually take a step back here. Yes, there are quite a few startups looking for pre-series A 1 to 25 crores of funding. So I'll just first touch upon the key aspects which we look at pitches in general, and then we can get into the biotech part. There are a few things which every startup hope covers in their tech. There are things team time, the product, talk about service, traction, competition. Timing is one part which start forget to cover. So if you can spend some time on that portion too. When it comes to in particular or deep tech in general, I think IP becomes very, very critical. So, if we can spend some more time, the founders can spend some time, explaining what the IP is, how is it differentiating them. So for an protein or fat from living microorganisms, for example, maybe insects, for example. So, if such a startup has to pitch, it would help if you can talk about the end product that the startup has come up with, but also talk about what are the current alternatives and how your product is actually superior to them. It might be product quality, pricing, etc., might be more sustainable. So those USPs have to very clearly come out in the pitch, and it makes the product that much more sellable. So that's one. Second, specifically for startups looking to raise $3-4 million or so, things like traction become important. So, if you can show some traction, show some continuous growth in that traction coming up, who are the eventual buyers, what the distribution will look like. Just touch upon them. You don't need to kind of make a 20-page page, in a 7 to 10-page page. If you can just touch upon these aspects, it kind of entices an investor to engage with you further. And then, of course, in detailed discussions, we can spend more time understanding what the startup is trying to do.
Thank you. Pinak, I would love to hear what you think, what excites you after the first meeting with an entrepreneur.
So, one of the challenges that many of the investors face while listening to pitches by biotech startups, and I think Saurabh had alluded to that. The fact of the matter is that there are not many technical experts in the country. So, as clear, as simple, and as technically non-challenging as possible. The whole idea is to show what is your value proposition and what is the differentiating factor for your value proposition, not getting into a lot of technical jargon. What happens because of that, and Arpit and you and I know what happens because of too much of complexity of technical jargon, is that you put off the investor at the end of the first meeting. Not that he is he does not like your product, but he said he thinks that it's too complex for me to get into it. So I think that's a very important aspect that startups need to kind of.
On this piece, let me just step in. I have realized that if the founder is not able to communicate to an investor in the first meeting, the founder is likely not being able to convince customers, communicate the same to a customer also. Because the clarity is not in the mind. So that I agree. That's a point. Please continue. Sorry, I'm commenting.
So the second point, of course, is once you have a pitch deck, you need to be able to kind of not really read the lines. That is something which the investor would obviously do. But be able to use that 1 hour that is given to you to come up with the right story for your product or a service that you're offering, and be able to show the investor that this is something which has a unique market, and your ability to capture that market has to be clearly articulated by the founders. Otherwise, it seems all over the place, and you really don't make head or tail out of that conversation that you've had. At the end of 60 minutes, the investor walks off thinking that it was a waste of his 1 hour, but and the founders and promoters think that it was a waste of their hour. But the fact of the matter is that the investor is looking at you with a very specific lens. It is not necessarily the same lens that all other peers in your technical field would be looking at you with. It is a different lens, and that lens is about techno-commercial lens. It has to have the commercial angle to it, and without which it will fall apart. In that conversation just tends to fall apart. Third is the very fact that you are going to the investor to raise a certain amount of capital. You have to be able to articulate the end use of capital. Because some XYZ company has raised 5 million, that is why you want 5 million, does not cut ice with the investor. You have to be able to demonstrate a tangible use for that 5 million that you raise, and how will you use it? What are the timelines for its usage? All of that needs to be kind of clearly articulated. Otherwise, it is like, I want 5 million because somebody else raised 5 million and they raised it at this valuation, so I want this valuation. So it becomes a discussion in futility after a certain point in time. And last but not the least, again, this is an important consideration. We are unfortunately not in the United States, where things are more evolved, the market is more evolved, the product margins are far more than what you have in the Indian context. Indian consumer, and even of health, is a very price sensitive consumer. Your margins will be far lesser in the Indian context as compared to both ASP and margins are lower as compared to the US market. So suddenly thinking that you will be able to kind of get the same benchmark valuation that a company which is of a similar profile is getting in the US, and you extrapolating that to the Indian context may not work.
Thank you. 2 points before I move on. I love to maybe talk about it as well. One is, yes, you are right. I will give you an example. One of our companies is a company called Bito. For those who are listening, at the point of time when Bito had about 1 lakh actively paying customer, Livongo had gone to public in US. Livongo was valued in the range of $20 billion, and Bito was struggling to raise at about 50 million at that point. So it's a massive difference in the ecosystem. Thank you, Vinay, for bringing this up. Also, on the commercial aspects, I would love to take an opinion across the table. Whose fault is it that the investors don't understand technical aspects of biotech? Is it investors' fault? Is it startups' fault? Or is it, nobody's fault, which is everyone's fault? What is your opinion? Mansi? Yes, no?
So I think I may have a slightly biased view here.
Please.
Because we are a healthcare fund, and at least I'm partially a doctor on the team. So we are trying to address it step by step. But certainly it's the ecosystem fault, and I think the investment community's fault. I mean, it's certainly not the entrepreneur's fault why there are no technical expertise on the table. But I think beyond technical expertise, because if the founder, I think some of the points that Pinak mentioned, if they get addressed in the first meeting when the founder is meeting a non-technical investor as well, I think if there is enough excitement in the system, technical expertise can be brought on board to evaluate a deal. So I don't think that is the reason why deals don't get done. I think it's the first meeting itself where things don't get communicated in the right manner is where things fall off.
Saurabh, your opinion?
See, my take is that at the end of the day, fundraising is a sales process. So the founder has to understand to whom he or she is trying to sell his or her idea or vision, and he or she has to do what it takes. So if a founder is meeting a investor with a technical background, then absolutely use all the jargons available in the world to have that discussion. It will make the discussion more engaging and fast. But if the founders are meeting sort of a generalist investor, it makes sense to use more of layman language so that the investor kind of at the end of the meeting is excited enough to continue. Partly I do feel there is some fault of the investor community too. It would again, I come from an electronics engineering background, and therefore one of the companies we invested, for example, is Attenberg, which made brushless DC motors. Back in the day when we first had a discussion with them, just because I could understand what they were trying to tell me, it made that much easier for me to quickly take a decision and invest. So technical expertise definitely matters. I think over time the investor ecosystem is also evolving. Perhaps in 5 years from now, we'll have biotech, or at least there are a few deep tech ones. We may have a few biotech focused funds also, and I think it's also I would say it's also up to the investors to kind of understand what a founder is doing and perhaps help him or her to translate that into a big business proposition. So at least part of it, the investors can also play a role. Yes, the entrepreneur has to be the main driver. But investors can also guide the entrepreneurs to some extent as to this great product which you have built, how it can be monetized or sold in a better way. So that's my take.
Thank you. Pinag, your opinion?
I think though I would obviously take some part of the blame as an investor of not understanding some of the very nuanced biotech startups. I think that in any case, even with the best expertise on board, a very nuanced biotech startup will require an external help for the fund to take on board to try and evaluate that opportunity. Having said that, one of the things that at the end of the day, if you were to look at it in a very pragmatic manner, the startup that is trying to raise funds is the seller, and the person who's trying to sell it to, which is the investor, is the customer for that product. And at all points in time, the startup has to go with the belief that the customer is always right. That is the basic philosophy of any kind of trade. So if you are able to convince the customer on the first call, then the customer will get whatever it takes to make it happen. But if that first call becomes a completely irrational call, then it does not make sense.
Super. This is great. Thank you. Moving on, what I would like to hear, there are two people who are medical doctors, and there's one person. Both of you have worked in clinic. What is it? Startup. What's the purpose that startups serve in the broader healthcare ecosystem? Let's start with India, because both of you have worked in India, and if they definitely help, then what is it that they can do better in general? Because most biotech companies will sell to providers in India. So what is it that they can do better to be even more useful or be accessible? Mansi, you want to go first?
Sure.
What
As a clinician, I guess, what is processing quality of care? Fundamentally, that's what anyone is looking at. But is it making the procedure better, faster, cheaper? I think some of those can be commercial decisions. So I think what as a startup can do for the ecosystem could be different for different stakeholders, because even a hospital, even a clinic has multiple stakeholders. A doctor is just one stakeholder. There is a procurement person whose priorities may be cost reduction, and hence his and the clinician's view may not align on maybe a